Welcome back. Now, as we wait for the Eric Boyd case to start back up after its lunch break, we're going to switch gears and start reviewing some of the testimony that we heard earlier this week. Now, if you recall, George Thomas, a co-defendant who is already serving time for this case and is testifying in hopes of reducing his life sentence down to 50 years, testified. Now, for the very first time, George Thomas claimed that Boyd had killed Christopher for the very first time. Let's take a listen to his testimony as he said this on the stand. So there you have George Thomas, co-defendant, who, like he said, is serving life currently in the hopes of reducing a sentence, testifying. Now, Latonia, in the past, we've talked about the witnesses for the prosecution. Oftentimes, the prosecutors don't get to pick the witnesses. Whoever sees it, sees it. And so they have to put on this witness who doesn't have the cleanest of hands, but he's the one pointing the finger. How do you really drive home that this person is credible and that his words are something that should be considered for the guilt of Eric Boyd?
Well, I guess what you do is more so than anything is obviously he's going to have the firsthand knowledge because he was a party to this whole crime. And so that's the reason why he's a person to listen to at this point in time. There's nothing for him to gain. He's serving his time at this point. But like you said, it's the same thing that happens with victims sometimes. You don't get to choose your victims and you don't get to choose who your witnesses are. And so you basically have to let the jury know why they're here. And you basically highlight the things that would be, I guess, the things you wouldn't want to highlight. You get that stuff out of the way. You go ahead and you talk about it right then and there.
Yeah, and it's difficult sometimes for witnesses like this because I believe this is the definition of an interested witness. This witness
Correct.
Does have some stakehold. So how do you kind of cleanse the palate, so to speak, knowing that the defense attorneys, probably the first thing they're going to say is, aren't you here testifying because you're going to get a reduced sentence? Are you here basically snitching just to kind of help yourself out? How do you lessen that blow knowing that it's about to come?
I mean, it's difficult on some levels, but you just go through it. You're like, he was there. He was a party to the situation. He's accepted his responsibility on some levels, I guess. Not really, but sorry, I shouldn't say it that way. But he is here, and he is. The reason why you need to listen to him is because he was a party to this. He knows what happened. And there's no guarantee that he's truly going to get a better sentence for testifying.
Yeah. And now, Norman, to you, this person has firsthand knowledge. They're there. Everyone knows that they participated in the crime, and he was found guilty of it. I mean, this can be some of the most damning testimony for your client in something like this. How do you prepare for that? How do you best sculpt your cross-examination for this person to try to show, hey, you're in it for yourself and not for the truth?
Right, like Latonia said, you have to just kind of show that this person has a reason to testify, that there's a benefit that they're going to get. And you also will do things like say, well, you're giving a version of the story, and these are the facts that are supported by the prosecutor. This is what the prosecutor wants you to say. You're saying what they want. You're giving their story. You're not giving your own story. You try to steer them away from them sitting there because they want to do the right thing. Like you have to attack, and when they say, oh, I want to do the right thing, then you kind of go through all the wrong things that they did in their lifetime. And oh, now, why now?
Yeah.
Like, wasn't the right thing to not kill this guy? You didn't think about that then. But you want this jury to believe that now you're on the side of right. And you just pick them apart.
We also have Xavier Jenkins, who testified to seeing the victim's car in the co-defendant's home. Let's take a listen to what Xavier had to say. It's very interesting comments that were given, some speculations, as you heard, in that objection. I'm still curious what a demeanor of a black person is and how you can tell, but we're still not hearing the crucial information of that was Eric Boyd connecting to the case. So hopefully the prosecution will be able to connect those dots to drive home their case if that's what they're hoping to do. But we are live now in court with a DNA expert being cross-examined, so let's take a listen to what's going on there. So a lot of scientific conversations going on with DNA. Obviously, in the Cargiolo case, we were talking about there being a lack of DNA. Now we have DNA to talk about. Norman, as a defense attorney, oftentimes we have to become experts in things that we didn't go to school for, we didn't learn about. DNA, how big is it? How do you confront it? How do you talk about it when it sometimes can point the finger to your client?
All right, there's several things. One, even if even if someone can prove that you were a contributor to the sample that they found on the back strap of a gun or on the floor or anyone, they cannot ever tell you when that sample was deposited. So let's say my DNA is found in a room on a glass, right? They don't know when I was in that room. They don't know when I touched the glass. They don't know if I had the glass in another location, somebody transported it to that location. I mean, there are a lot of things that you can attack. You can attack also too, DNA can be transferred from one surface to another, which might explain why it ends up in one place versus another. Also too, people don't shed skin cells or deposit DNA at the same rate. Some will deposit a ton of DNA by touching something, and others will deposit none by touching the same thing for the same amount of time. So there's a lot of things scientifically that you can do to show that the DNA is either compelling and does prove guilt, or that it's not compelling and it doesn't prove guilt.
Yeah. And Latonia, as we had mentioned earlier in this segment, jurors are looking to hear the science. They're looking to hear about DNA. And when we're measuring DNA in such a small amount, I know they measure in terms of picograms, so it's a trillionth of a gram. The smallest of touch can leave DNA. And it's not just skin cells here they're talking about. They're talking about blood and semen. It seems like this is the strong evidence that might be lacking in other cases we're covering that are obviously present in this case. How are the prosecution going to tie that in with their case?
Yeah, and here's the thing. It's just so devastating when you look about what happened in this case. There's a lot of DNA, actually, with regard to female in this, with regard to Shannon, because she was violently raped in multiple places. And so they are able to have this DNA. And so what this DNA puts is, one, that these people were at the scene. It's not something like we were just talking about the Hollywood Ripper case where it's like, oh, why would that person be there? It doesn't make any sense. Well, we know the DNA puts you there, and that's very strong evidence. And ever since we've had CSI, that's what jurors look for. Not only do you have this evidence is also helpful to prove the true crime. Sometimes the DNA is to show that you had a murder weapon or you were in the place. But one of the charges is rape. And so you have the actual fluids when the DNA to prove that you actually had some type of sexual, contact with this person. So that makes it even stronger. And then as you heard the expert testifying to, the thing about DNA, it also rules out other categories of people. And so that the category that you're ruling to be the person as the perpetrator, they look like the person who's on trial, and then it's more probable than not that this is DNA matches DNA also collected from the person now. And so that makes it very strong evidence.
Yeah, because you have to recall, it's very obvious that Eric Boyd is an African-American male and the other co-defendants are African-American. So when you're hearing this sample comes from someone from this population rather than this, it again narrows it down. We're going to continue with the Boyd case and more after this break. So there you can see the witness now stepping off the stand. There was a bit of a back and forth with the prosecutor coming back to redirect and then the defense attorney asking that one extra question. As we are summing up with the DNA experts' testimony now, we're getting a little bit more insight to this case, Norman. We're seeing a little bit more as to how the prosecution is connecting the dots. How do you think the case is going so far, I guess, would be the major question.
I mean, I guess it's going okay for the prosecution. I mean, of course, they have to connect the dots, and it's our job to kick those dots around to opposite ends of the room. And I'm not so sure that the defense was really able to do that, that cross.
And Latonia, it's going to be a very interesting case as it continues. I know we can still see some rumbling in the court there. We're going to wait for another witness to take the stand. But while we wait, Latonia, it seems to be coming together. All the things we typically ask that we need, all the things we typically ask that is needed of a case, they seem to be bringing it in here. What's next, do you think, for the prosecution to really drive this case home?
I mean, you've got the connection of the dots. And then I think also just going back over the medical evidence of what happened to these victims. I mean, the thing that really drives it home for this case more so than anything is the DNA evidence. It's very hard to get over the DNA evidence for people who don't know each other, and for them to have encountered these people it's very hard for the defense to argue around that. And then you've got co-defendants who also testify and say that they were a part of this situation as well. So I think it's very hard. And I think the thing that's going to be very hard also is it was such a heinous, evil act that happened to this young couple. Those things coupled together with this DNA evidence, the testimony of the other co-conspirators, I think it's a very, very hard case for the defense.
Yeah, and Norman, I get it. As defense attorneys, we always tell juries, don't think of the sympathy. Take the heinous act out of your mind. We know that it's horrible, and only think about the facts and the burden as they're laid out to you. But people are human. I mean, I looked at this for the first time when we first started following this case, and before we even started hearing testimony, I thought, oh, this guy better get the max sentence. I mean, how do you pull someone away from that and try to get them to believe in your case as a defense attorney?
I think when we were off camera, you talked about how one of your law school professors gave you a hypothetical that allowed you to build on your summations. And it's kind of similar thing here, that you have to approach your delivery to the jury as if you're a college professor. And you can say to them like, look, you can be offended. You can hate what happened. I don't like what happened either. This should not happen to anyone. But you have to take those feelings and put them aside and just look at things very surgically, very scientifically. And you have to make sure that the prosecutor sustain their burden. You can't help them out because you don't like what happened. You have to be able to separate. You have to remind them of that. You almost have to give them that guilt of, don't be sympathetic. Do your job. Follow the Constitution.
Yeah, and on the flip side, Latonia, I mean, this is a case that I would imagine is the reason why many prosecutors go to law school. This is a type of case where I think they're trying to seek justice because there was the ultimate injustice done here. And if they truly believe that these are the ones who perpetrated this crime, I would think there's going to be the most impassioned of closing arguments, the strongest of evidence put forward to try to incarcerate Eric Boyd. How does a prosecution turn this DNA expert conversation that's very technical and methodical to the impassioned argument that's needed to be had here?
I mean, you just go with the facts that you've got, and the facts that you have, you don't need to embellish it. It's there, it's right there, what these poor people went through. But for the actions, the callousness, the lack of humanity done by this defendant, this young couple would be here. And not only that, when you go over what poor Shannon went through for over 24 hours, how you didn't even care about the bodies, how you tried to destroy them, the fact that you gave no mercy whatsoever to these two human beings, that's what you go over. You don't have to embellish it. The facts are right there. They are startling, they are upsetting, and not only that, you've got, outside of what Norman's saying, which is right, which is you try to tell them as a defense attorney to take the emotional aspect out of it, but you can't take the emotional aspect out of it when you've got direct evidence, which is what the DNA evidence is showing that these people were the ones who perpetrated this. And especially Eric Boyd at this point, because we've already had the co-defendants also testified to his involvement.
So the witness there being the medical examiner is a little off the screen, so we're going to talk a little bit about this. I know it can be a little dry, but if you dive deep into it, it's outlining a very horrific and traumatic experience. Norman, you caught something out of the corner of your eye as we're watching this from the camera. What are you seeing here as we're listening to all of these horrible, horrible injuries?
Well, our cameraman viewed into the audience, and you could see both sets of parents listening to this testimony, and you could see the grief in their face. Even on one set of the parents, there was a person sitting behind the parents with her hands on the shoulders of both. This is the part of trial that is tough because it's hard to listen to anybody talk about an autopsy about a person that's not connected to you. But when you're hearing about how an autopsy is being conducted on a loved one, It's just traumatic. It's almost like going through the bad incident all over again. And the jurors are going to look into the audience, and they're going to look at the parents, and they're going to see the grief on their face, and it's very hard to shake those feelings of sympathy as a juror, because you have to get back to business. You have to go back and focus on what the witness is saying on the stand, which is just tough. To talk about body destruction and bullets in the base of the skull, and oh my goodness, it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, kind of like what you said earlier, where the defense attorney's got to be a little professorial. They've got to be the person that says, hey, we've got to stick to the facts, stick to the burden, and you've got to come back with a verdict based on that. But jurors are human. And they're not going to just be listening to the witness stand. They're going to be watching the defendant on the stand. They're going to be watching the prosecutor. They're going to be watching the audience. And they're going to be, if the prosecution does this right, and I'm assuming they will, they're going to be emboldened by the prosecutor to say, hey, it is your opportunity to bring justice. And for some of the jurors, if not all of them, they're going to be looking at the parents and saying, hey, I'm going to bring you justice. I'm going to bring this verdict home for you. And I think when this witness is testifying, that is absolutely what's going on in a lot of the jurors' mind. We're going to probably continue to go back into court and listen to more of the medical examiner's arguments as to what she saw a little bit after this break.